The INFJ and the INTJ personality types. Despite these two types sharing the same dominant function, they do in fact process information in a radically different way. In this video I'm going to be breaking down the major differences between these two personalities and hopefully imparting a clearer means of identifying these differences in real life. So first, let's compare the dominant stacks. The dominant stack of the INFJ is introverted intuition and introverted thinking. Therefore, this is an individual who's gazing predominantly at objective data within their vast internal landscape. This is a type who's constantly theorizing, who's constantly conceptualizing new ideas. They are generally quite playful with their ideas and they like to construct new things for the sake of novelty within their minds. They're constantly seeking to add new things to their objective circuits and tend to prefer creating these things within their own mind than they do actually intaking them from the external world. The introverted thinking of the INFJ is primarily informed by extroverted feeling. That means they are gazing predominantly at social information within their minds and trying to make sense of it. This is a type who takes in social information and then collates it within this kind of introverted, intuitive, introverted thinking landscape in order to rationalize human information. This type is predominantly concerned as such with existential topics, with various different philosophies, with various different kind of psychological perspectives. And while they lean heavily towards these areas, they can also take an interest in like health and nutrition and such, because anything that has a human factor is fascinating to the INFJ, and they will generally be constructing a lot of their own theories and a lot of their own kind of perspectives based upon the information which is human, based upon information which is social, based upon information which is emotional. The INTJ, on the other hand, well, this dominant stack is introverted intuition and introverted feeling. Therefore, the type gazes predominantly at their vast internal emotional landscape. This type is extremely in touch with its own values, extremely in touch with its identity, and extremely in touch with its own personal happiness. While the INFJ is primarily responsible for its objective circuits, the INTJ is primarily responsible for its limbic circuits. Generally, the INTJ is very private because they don't want other people to influence their emotional worlds. Just as the INFJ is in many ways protective over the originality of their ideas, the INTJ is protective over the originality of their core self, of their values. Therefore, both types are highly individualistic, but the individualism of the INFJ is more theoretical, while the individualism of the INTJ is more limbic. The introverted feeling of the INTJ is informed primarily by extroverted thinking. That means this is the type who forms deep and meaningful connections to the mechanical world around them. They'll often be very attached to mechanisms, to theories, to constructions in the outside world that have a lot of symbolic meaning. And they will often invest heavily into these external manifestations of logical order. Generally, the INTJ is a type that takes in mechanical information, forms very deep attachments to it, and then innovates upon that attachment. The innovations of the INTJ are often very deep and personal, and as such the type will often hesitate, if not completely refuse to innovate, if they are not highly emotionally connected to that which they are going to innovate upon. This is why the stereotype assigned to the INTJ as someone who just innovates in a stride and just innovates for its own sake is completely inaccurate, because the type often has to be very emotionally invested into something before they want to turn their creative energies into turning it into a better form of itself. So the INFJ takes in social information, collates it within an introverted, intuitive, introverted thinking landscape, rationalizes it through that process, and then conveys it to other people to help them. The INTJ, on the other hand, they take in mechanical information, they form attachments to it, and then through that attachment and the creative energies that spur from it, the type then transmits those energies back into the outside world in order to innovate and come up with new ways of doing things. So now let's look at the opposing stacks. While both these types do share a oppositional extroverted sensing in common, the implications of this are completely and utterly different due to the differing auxiliaries to which this extrovert sensing is attached. The extroverted sensing of the INFJ is attached to extroverted feeling. Therefore, when the type is able to engage properly with the concrete world, this is a type who gazes primarily at people. They're very observational when it comes to people. It's going to be within a very narrow scope due to the concrete and very detail-oriented nature of extrovert sensing, but generally they'll be picking up a lot of information. INFJs love one-on-one conversations. We love to be in a contained social situation because there's a lot of information that we can pick up on. We generally are a quality over quantity kind of socialite. And since this primary external lens of the INFJ is predisposed to gaze more at social information than it is mechanical, they will often be very clumsy, they will often be very unaware of objects and mechanisms. The INTJ, on the other hand, is the complete opposite. They are often highly aware of the object. They are very highly aware of the mechanisms. They often convey an excellent sense of spatial awareness. However, the trade-off here is the fact that they are generally often oblivious to social information. Whereas the INFJ is very attuned to the social intricacies, to micro-expressions and whatnot, such subtleties of social expression often go unbeknownst to the INTJ. So generally, the INFJ is someone who's very detail-oriented towards social information, whereas the INTJ is very detail-oriented towards mechanical information. Therefore, the INFJ will have incredible attention to detail when it comes to a social situation, especially if it's quite small and contained, whereas the INTJ, on the other hand, will apply that specificity to the mechanical situation. They will often be very aware of the different kind of mechanical components in that extrovert sensing world that they are perceiving. So generally, the oppositional extrovert sensing gives both of these types a very intense and focused gaze. However, the intensity of the INFJ's gaze is often accompanied by a plethora of different emotional expressions. So in many ways, the INFJ is often the more emotionally expressive of the two, but you could even say that INFJ's social expressions are a lot more superficial, whereas the social expressions of the INTJ are a lot more deep. But either way, both these types lock on to specific details and are very detail-oriented people. The detail-orientedness of the INFJ is concerned with emotions, whereas the detail-orientedness of the INTJ is concerned with mechanics. So now let's talk about the attitudes. The attitudes of the INFJ are completely different to the attitudes of the INTJ, and this is one major way of telling the difference between the two. So first, let's look at the INFJ. The INFJ's thinking function is convergent by nature. Whether it's extroverted or introverted, this is a type who likes to find their own way of doing things. They often like to express their individuality through their logical cogitations. The INFJ's priority is finding a novel way to think, finding a novel way to express themselves in a mechanical world even, finding a novel way of doing something. Generally, the INFJ likes to find their own way of doing something, which can be very frustrating to the INTJ. Let's say they're playing a video game together or something, because the INTJ just wants to be efficient. They just want to complete things in the best way, whereas the INFJ is actually prioritizing their own hubris, their own need for novelty over efficiency. The feelings of the INFJ, on the other hand, are more divergent in nature, therefore they're more negative, they're more consequence instilling. Both introverted feeling and extroverted feeling play an authoritative role in the INFJ, but generally the introverted feeling bows down to the sovereignty of extrovert feeling. Therefore, the INFJ is going to be very impulsive. They're still going to follow their own needs, still going to do what they want to do, and then they're going to rationalize that with their introverted thinking rather than vice versa. But if what they want is in conflict with the social norm, if what they want is in conflict with the needs of another person or the needs of the social situation, and if what they want is going to sow disharmony, then generally they will avoid doing what they want because they still want to prioritize the social order of the external world. And as such, you have someone who's deeply in touch with their own thoughts, who's constantly playing around with those thoughts and finding novel, new perspectives when it comes to objective substrate. While at the same time, the type is generally not as responsible for their own emotions, not as responsible for the emotions of other people. They're not as actively empathetic, and therefore this is a type who generally avoids disharmony, avoids bad situations. The INFJ is going to have more difficulty controlling their values and such, which are generally more hard-coded. And generally they just wish to comply with their internal harmony and their external harmony without actually taking any responsibility for it. And now let's take the attitudes of the INTJ personality type. The INTJ is a convergent feeler. That means they're responsible for their feelings. They are actively assessing who they are. They're actively monitoring their feelings. They're actively monitoring their limbic state. The INTJ emphasizes originality of limbic thought. And just as the INTJ can get annoyed with the INFJ for their kind of obsessive need for novelty in their mechanical expressions and their ways of thinking, in their kind of devil's advocate approach to logic, the INFJ can equally get annoyed with the INTJ's need for limbic originality, can often find the INTJ to be kind of emotionally inefficient because they're prioritizing their sense of individuality over what seems to be emotionally logical in the INFJ's eyes. So while an INTJ's feeling is convergent and therefore they're actively taking responsibility for it and projecting an idealized version of themselves into the future, their thinking, on the other hand, is highly divergent. So while the feelings of the INTJ are convergent and thus they are actively monitoring their own emotional state and projecting an idealized version of themselves into the future, the thinking of the INTJ is divergent. This means while the INFJ is constantly looking for an original perspective on some kind of objective substrate, The INTJ is a lot more certain and hard-headed and evidence-based. Often the INTJ will prefer to read up on something, to read another person's opinion, to read another person's research. And if the INTJ ever does decide to create their own original view of something, their own original theory of something, generally it'll be an amalgamation of different theories that they have read. Generally, when it comes to objective understanding, the INTJ will make a lot more appeals to authority, just as the INFJ will make much more emotional appeals to authority. Just as the INFJ is averse to social conflict, social disorder, the INTJ is incredibly averse to mechanical disorder. Just as an INFJ will be distressed when they see social order disrupted, the INTJ will be very distressed when they see mechanical order disrupted. And this is why these two types often clash. The INFJ doesn't really care that much about mechanical order, and we actually like to play around with different ways of doing things just for the sake of novelty. The INTJ, on the other hand, doesn't care quite as much for emotional order. Generally, the INFJ can get extremely aggrieved when the INTJ is being very disagreeable, because the INFJ prioritizes the emotional order, whereas the INTJ prioritizes the objective order, efficiency, whether or not something is logical. So whether it be an introverted thinking fact or the mechanical workings of the external world, the INTJ will be very stressed out if they find any of these efficient systems are disrupted. So we can actually look at this from a pressure point perspective. The pressure point of the INFJ is social order, emotional order, whereas the pressure point of the INTJ is logical order, mechanical order. So the INFJ gets very stressed out by emotional conflict, whereas the INTJ gets very stressed out by logical and mechanical conflict. So generally the INTJ is going to be a lot more well-read than the INFJ because they consult a lot more external sources of objective information. The INFJ, on the other hand, is often going to be a lot more socialized than the INTJ, if that makes sense, because they're often going to be consulting more external manifestations of emotional order. Because while the INTJ takes in divergent mechanical information and extrapolates it within an NI-FI medium, the INFJ takes in external divergent emotional data and extrapolates it within their convergent NI-TI medium. So now that we've compared the conscious stacks of these types and also looked at the ways in which their attitudes differ, it's now time to look at the unconscious functions. So in the dominant stack of the INFJ, we have an unconscious extroverted thinking. Therefore, this type will generally be quite oblivious to the objects in the world around them. They're generally going to be walking into things, they're going to be quite clumsy, and they'll often take a little while to figure out how a mechanism works, especially due to its convergent nature. Because the extrovert thinking of the INFJ is convergent, even if they do bring it to consciousness, they want to figure out their own way of doing things. They're not going to read a manual, and therefore they're often going to be very inefficient. The dominant stack of the INFJ has an unconscious extroverted thinking. This means that the type generally is fairly unaware of the mechanical world around them and the way in which those mechanical components interact with each other in order to form a result. Owing to the convergent nature of the dominant stack, when the INFJ does actually bring extroverted thinking to consciousness, generally this type is going to be obsessed with finding their own way around something. They're going to be trying to find their own method, and they're often going to be quite averse to reading a manual or following any kind of instructions. And with this in mind, while the INFJ may very well find a novel approach, and it may even be fairly entertaining, and heck, it may even be of some contribution to the human race, more often than not, it's going to result in a very inefficient way of doing something. And within the oppositional stack, the INFJ's introverted feeling is unconscious. That means the type is often going to be quite unaware of what they're feeling. Don't get me wrong, they're still going to be a very emotional type. They're still going to be very emotionally expressive, for example. But oftentimes when this type is emotionally expressive, it's usually because they don't have a lot of control over those emotions in the first place. They don't have a plug, essentially. Due to the unconscious nature of FI within the INFJ, they will often lack a certain degree of relational empathy. It doesn't mean that they're not extremely empathetic, they are, but what it does mean is that they often not be consciously placing themselves in the position of another person and certainly not feeling the emotions of the other person outside of the extroverted sensing moment. The INFJ will also have difficulty monitoring their emotional well-being and taking control over it. Generally, the INFJ will have a lot of emotional expression, and it'll often take someone passing us by to let us know we're feeling a certain way due to the expression that we're giving off. And then that'll often come as a surprise to us because we're not that aware of the emotions we're feeling in the first place. And then when someone points them out, we're like, oh, cool, okay, great. Now I can do something with this. Maybe I can rationalize this now that I know about it. The INTJ, on the other hand, well, this type has a tremendous amount of control over their emotions. They can actively conceal from another person any emotion that they want to. And oftentimes, this type is much more innately mysterious than the INFJ. While the INFJ cannot really help giving off all the emotions that they don't even know they're feeling in the first place, the INTJ knows exactly what they're feeling, and it can actually conceal that from other people. This is often an extremely private type. Actually, a main reason for why the INTJ is so private a lot of the time is because this type actually has, unlike the INFJ again, the ability to actively shape and reconfigure their identity according to the emerging logical situation. This type can actually change their values. This type can actually evolve who they are. Whereas the INFJ has very little control over that, who they feel they are innately. Therefore, the INFJ is constantly trying to rationalize why they're acting a certain way. They're constantly trying to rationalize why they're doing this certain thing. The INTJ, on the other hand, well, they're trying to come to emotional terms with why this thing is more logical than something else. And therefore, the INTJ can actually constantly evolve themselves over time. This can actually manifest in a predisposition towards being quite private because the INTJ is aware, profoundly aware, of how much they can be affected by the external world. The INTJ, on the other hand, tends to lack emotional awareness of the external situation. They're often very oblivious to what another person's feeling. They're often very oblivious to the micro expressions in any given social environment. Should the INTJ ever bring extrovert feeling to consciousness, they'll generally be more playful with it. They'll generally try and find a more original solution. Within the oppositional stack, the introverted thinking of the INTJ is comparably more unconscious. A lot of the time, the INTJ will often know the answer for something, and they'll often know why something is more logical than something else, but when asked to repeat their mental processes, when asked to convey through verbal means the vast underlying reasons why one logical method is better than another one, the INTJ may actually struggle with this. The INTJ may actually struggle gazing into their objective internal landscape and bringing it to consciousness. Oftentimes, the INTJ will know why something's correct. Oftentimes, the INTJ will know why this thing is this thing. But they wouldn't necessarily be able to convey to another person their introverted thinking dialogue. And a lot of the time, the reason why the INTJ is more predisposed towards looking to external manifestations of logic, such as, scientific literature, is because the type doesn't necessarily have that much of an awareness of what logical circuits they are activating within their introverted thinking landscape. As such, the INTJ will often rely on an external manifestation of logical order in order to convey their introverted thinking process. Often they'll be drawing diagrams, often they'll be creating graphics in order to convey something. The INFJ, on the other hand, will actually struggle a lot of the time to manifest their introverted thinking ideas into a diagram. Whereas with the INTJ, this generally comes in their stride. And just as the INFJ will often externalize their own emotions through a medium such as art, for example, in order to be able to actually rationalize them and perceive them in the first place, the INTJ will do this for logic. They will externalize their introverted thinking cogitations into a externally perceivable form. They will manifest their introverted thinking into reality, and therefore they will know what they're thinking by what they've manifested externally. And with all of these cognitive functions now explored, I want to revisit the attitudes. Both the extrovert thinking and the introvert thinking of the INFJ is intrinsically connected to their introverted intuition. Therefore, this is something that the INFJ gazes at with a very wide scope. Often the INFJ fixates upon pattern seeking and stuff within their logical circuits. And this applies very much the same way with their extrovert thinking too. They are looking at the vast plethora of the external mechanical landscape, when they actually manage to bring it to consciousness, that is, and then they are trying to find a universal connection, a way in which all of these components, mechanical components, connect together. Therefore, the extrovert thinking of the INFJ is more comparable to the ENFP and to the ESTJ, both types who try and gaze across a broad scope of the external world in order to bring plethoric order. This directly contrasts with the way the INTJ approaches logic. Generally, the INTJ will be externalizing their logic and they'll be cogitating in a very specific kind of way. These types are going to be very certain about what they're thinking. They're going to be very certain about the efficiency of any given method, and generally the scope that they're using in these cogitations, whether they be external or internal, is going to be very narrow and very detailed in nature. generally the holistic view of the INTJ is going to be predisposed towards their emotions. They're going to be taking an introverted intuitive wide-angle lens to their limbic world rather than their cerebral world. And as such, the identity and the emotions of the INTJ are going to be a lot more multifaceted. Their entire view of this is more holistic in nature, more plethoric. This applies very much to their incredible depth of relational empathy. Generally, the INTJ can empathize with anyone because they can consult their vast array of emotional experience and emotional storage and multifaceted identity in order to know exactly what another person would be feeling, or exactly how they would be feeling if they were in that person's position. And this is why the INTJ is probably the most underrated empath of all the 16 types, because this type is so empathetic. This type is so imaginative in their empathy. They can relate to almost anyone, and they are often extremely moved by any kind of predicament another person is in, and then they feel motivated to help that person. The INTJ is so altruistic, and this often goes completely and utterly overlooked within this kind of Jungian typological world. And this contrasts directly with the feelings of the INFJ. The feelings of the INFJ are much more specific. If they are activating relational empathy, it's usually because the INFJ has been in that exact situation before. It's much more intense, it's much more detailed, but it's much less plethoric in the INFJ's case. Furthermore, when it comes to emotional solutions, the INTJ is a lot more imaginative and a lot more open-ended. The INFJ will usually be a lot more direct, a lot more specific, and a lot more certain about what emotional solution is right for any given situation. So, to wrap up, the dominant stack of the INFJ is predominantly cerebral, while the dominant stack of the INTJ is predominantly limbic. The divergent stack of the INFJ is predominantly limbic and concerned with external social order, and conversely, the divergent stack of the INTJ is predominantly cerebral and more concerned with the order of the external world. In terms of attitudes, the thinking of the INFJ is more convergent, therefore they're trying to seek new connections between various different objective substrates all the time. They're often trying to find innovative means of thinking about things. The INTJ, on the other hand, their feeling is more convergent, therefore they're trying to innovate themselves, they're trying to be an individual, they're trying to have unique and powerful internal values. The feeling of the INFJ is divergent, and therefore they're generally conflict evasive. They generally like to maintain the social order of the external and to some extent internal worlds. They often prioritize social order over logical order, whereas the INTJ, with a divergent extrovert thinking, they tend to prioritize logical order over emotional order. The logic of the INFJ will be very open-ended, whereas the emotions of the INFJ, whether external or internal, tend to be much more specific and certain. The emotions of the INTJ tend to be a lot more open-ended and experimental, whereas the logical deliberations of the INTJ tend to be a lot more certain and a lot more absolute. And finally, for levels of consciousness, the INFJ has a highly unconscious extroverted thinking, and therefore they tend to be fairly oblivious to the mechanical world around them and will often struggle learning new mechanisms and often struggle trying to figure out how one mechanism seems to be working, while simultaneously being averse to reading any kind of manual. The INTJ will be quite the opposite. They'll generally be very happy to read a manual because of the divergent nature of their extrovert thinking. Oftentimes the INFJ will also have an unconscious introvert feeling, and therefore they're not going to be as directly in touch with their own emotions as the INTJ is. Taking the INTJ again, they tend to have a fairly unconscious extrovert feeling. Therefore, when it comes to the emotional order of the world around them, they tend to be fairly oblivious to it. And if they are going to try and exert social order, they generally won't do so in a way which complies with social norms. Generally, they'll find their own way of bringing social order to the world, and in the INFJ's eyes, this may not always be the most efficient way of doing so. So as usual, thank you so much for watching that video. I really hope it's informative. Let me know your thoughts down below. I'd absolutely love to hear your own INFJ and INTJ stories in the comments. Be sure to leave a like on the video. It really helps the channel grow and develop and reach new audiences. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button down below to stay notified of future content. I upload a video every single week, so I will be back here, same place, same time next week. Take care.